And with that motivation, then, if you know, we can recite that verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So I was thinking again today, kind of like we did last time, to start off by looking a little bit more at the commentary recommended by FPMT, the one I started last time, the Tendar Larampa's commentary. And then we'll use that to transition into the actual text of the Heart Sutra itself. And you know, like for those of you who didn't, most of you I think were here, but Tendar Larampa's commentary is on the website for free, so you can, you know, it's right there for free. If you don't already have it, you can download it. It's a PDF, and you can look it on your device, or you can print it out. And I'm going to pick up in his commentary near the bottom of page 9. Yeah, so we're going to jump to there. And there, Tendar Larampa, who's, you know, I said last time, I think he's a little, he was from Drepung Monastery, Monastic University, Mongolian Lama who studied in Tibet. But he starts off, and so he was a Drepung, so he starts off by saying, in the great monasteries such as Sera and Drepung, you know, and so Sera is where Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche and Lama Zopa Rinpoche have both studied. I think Tendar Larampa himself studied at Drepung. So he says, and those monasteries before, and I remember at the first class I said that in the, you know, the great monasteries, they recite the Heart Sutra numerous times a day, right? And so he points out, he says, before reciting the sutra, it is customary to recite these verses of praise and obeisance. And then he quotes a verse so that they would recite at the monastery before reciting the Heart Sutra. And the verse says, I bow down to the mother of the conquerors of the 3 times. The perfection of wisdom, inexpressible by words or thoughts, which is unproduced and unceased like the entity of the sky, the object of the wisdom of unique knowledge. And then he says, it is said that these verses are words recited by the Buddha's son, Rahula, to his mother, who would have been the Buddha's wife, actually, right before he left to become a monk. And so, you know, Rahula, right, was raised by his mother, actually, right? Because the Buddha was out meditating. Later, he became a monk himself and then became an arhat under the sort of guidance of his father and a teacher in his own right. But so this quote, right? I bow down to the mother of the conquerors of the 3 times. So what's the mother of the conquerors of 3 times? The Prajnaparamita. Because all the Buddhas are born from that wisdom, right? The wisdom, understanding, emptiness, selflessness. So he says, I bow down to the mother of the conquerors of 3 times, the perfection of wisdom, inexpressible by words or thoughts. So in other words, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in one sense, we said like the one version of the perfection of wisdom is textual, right? The texts. But the actual meaning of the perfection of wisdom is, as he says, inexpressible by words or thoughts, right? What does that mean? It means it's the actual, you know, the definitive meaning of the perfection of wisdom is wisdom directly realizing emptiness, right? So it's non-conceptual. Actually, I'll share, this comes later in the text, but maybe it seems relevant, so I'll just say it now. Like, you know, we've said this before, but like prajnaparamita, right? The perfection of wisdom. Actually, there are a lot of different meanings to that, aren't there? So usually they I think I said this briefly in the first class, but in brief, they categorize it sometimes as 4 things in some lists. One is the natural perfection of wisdom. And so that's emptiness itself, right? Which is always there. The emptiness of your mind, the emptiness of your person. Then there's the text perfection of wisdom. These are the books, right, that teach the perfection of wisdom. Then there's the path perfection of wisdom. So that would be the mind directly realizing emptiness, right? Particularly of a bodhisattva. And then there's the resultant perfection of wisdom, which is the wisdom of a Buddha, right? The omniscient mind of a Buddha. And just to get a little bit philosophical for a moment, Chitamatrans, mind-only school, Mahayana school, they assert that only the final one, only the resultant one, the mind of a Buddha, is the actual perfection of wisdom. All the others are, what's the word? Like called perfection of wisdom, but they're not the actual meaning. Prasangika Madhyamikas disagree with that. They say path, perfection, wisdom, and result. Like, so any mind that's direct of somebody with bodhicitta, Yume Kensro Rinpoche taught to Hertz, said this. He said, when a being has bodhicitta and then they directly realize emptiness under the influence of that bodhicitta, that's the real meaning of the perfection of wisdom. So that would be the path, like Arya Bodhisattvas, and the result. And both say that the natural perfection of wisdom, meaning emptiness, is not the actual perfection of wisdom, but it's required. It has to exist, or it couldn't, it exists already, right? Naturally, and it's what's realized. And then the textual perfection of wisdom is what helps us realize the actual perfection of wisdom, right? But it's not the actual, it's a book. One other thought I'll just share is, so then that's the meaning of the actual perfection of wisdom, right? So then you could ask, like, well, then can we practice the perfection of wisdom, right? Because we don't have that, assuming you're not an Arya Bodhisattva who's directly realized emptiness, then you don't have the perfection of wisdom experience yet. We can't have that yet. I was just reading yesterday actually, a text by Lama Tsongkhapa about perfection of wisdom. He used these metaphors I thought were quite interesting. One was a fruit, and he said, as it relates to also that first line, thus that I heard at one time, where he was pointing out that the Buddhas know, like as a teacher, the Buddha knows the time when a piece of fruit is ripe. Does that make sense? And before it's ripe, it's not ripe. It can't be, it can't be enjoyed. The point being, like, in other words, so the Buddha knows when a being is ready to actually realize the perfection of wisdom. Right? And then Lama Tsongkhapa gives another analogy there, where he says, if somebody has like what's it called, like a boil or something like that a skilled physician knows when to leave it alone and when it's ready to be pierced, right, to heal. And he says the Buddha is like that they know when a being is ready for a certain kind of purification and when it's not the right time. And so, it's only at the path of seeing and the path of meditation, the path of no more learning, these very exalted paths, that a person actually has the perfection of wisdom. But then I want to emphasize, but of course we can practice the perfection of wisdom, even though, but the practice of it is something, and it says this, for those of you who are in the class on the middle length Lamrim, it mentions things like this, that those things are causes, actually. Like, so anytime you meditate on emptiness, that's not the actual perfection of wisdom, if you haven't realized emptiness directly, but you're practicing in the sense of you're preparing, like you're creating the causes, right? You're ripening, you're like the fruit that's not yet ripe, but how does it become ripe, right? Like an actual fruit, like if you go now to like an apple orchard, right? They're little tiny, right? But they have to be out there and they need water, they need sunlight, and gradually they'll ripen, right? So we're like the unripe fruit. And so, of course, we have to practice the perfection of wisdom, but it's an interesting point, isn't it? That our practice of perfection of wisdom is not actually perfection of wisdom, right? And I used this analogy once. I said it's like somebody who says they're practicing for the Olympics, right? When somebody's practicing for the Olympics, they're not yet in the Olympics, right? So you could say, like, so the person who says, oh yeah, I'm training for the Olympics and I'm practicing for the Olympics, but that person is not yet, maybe if there's their first time, they haven't yet gone to the Olympics, right? So it's a bit like that. So for us, we're like that, right? We're training in the perfection of wisdom. We're practicing perfection of wisdom, but we haven't yet gotten to the experience of the perfection of wisdom. Anyway, so here when he says, I explained all that. So now if we go back to this verse by Rahula, right? It says, inexpressible by words or thoughts. So that's getting at the person who has the actual experience from the Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective of the actual perfection, which means a direct realization of emptiness that's non-conceptual. So it's beyond words and beyond thoughts. You only get there, of course, through words and thoughts, which is why we need text, right? But they're like sometimes traditional Buddhist metaphors that the words and thoughts are like a raft, right? To get you to the other shore. When you get to the other shore, you can leave behind. You don't need the raft at that time. So on the one hand, we need words and thoughts in order to approach the perfection of wisdom. But when one is in the actual experience of the perfection of wisdom, it's beyond words and thoughts. It's inexpressible. Then he says, unproduced and unceasing like the entity of the sky, right? So one point there is that emptiness is unproduced and unceasing, right? It's not produced by causes and conditions. But another meaning here where it says like the entity of the sky, right, is it's a mere negation, right? Just like the sky is, or space, right, is empty of obstruction. Just so emptiness itself is the negation, right? A negation of inherent existence, a negation of independent existence. So it's, some they often say that, right? Space or the sky are the best metaphor for emptiness, although they're only a metaphor. And then it says the object of the wisdom of unique knowledge, right? So that unique knowledge, wisdom, right, is the mind, is that special mind, a mind of transcendental wisdom, directly realizing emptiness, and only that kind of mind, right? It's a mind realizing ultimate truth. So that's the meaning there of that verse. And then he says, these words were recited by Rahula. And then now Tendar Larampa explains a little bit. He says, the meaning is that the wisdom that goes and is gone beyond samsara does so by means of the wisdom directly realizing emptiness, right? Like I said, directly realizing, non-conceptually. That wisdom is not an object that can be expressed by speaking words or thinking thoughts. Because the wisdom is not created by way of its own entity, right? It is not destroyed, but like the expanse of the sky is the negation of being established by way of its own entity. That very thing which serves as the sphere of the unique knowledge of the meditative equipoise is the mother that gives birth to all the conquerors of the three times. It is the obeisance. This is the obeisance to the wisdom that knows emptiness directly. So that's kind of very clear. And that's what we're studying, right? Prajnaparamita. And then on the next page, he starts to explain, Tendar Larampa starts to explain the title, which we've gone into great detail about, so I won't recover that. The Arya Bhagavati Prajnaparamita Hridaya Sutra, we covered that in detail, so I'm not going to go back over it. But then he quotes, then Tendar Larampa quotes Lama Tsongkhapa in his, here he calls it small essence of good explanations, or the small essence of eloquence. This is a beautiful text. Sometimes it's called the praise to dependent origination, or praise to Buddha for teaching dependent origination. I guess the full title is the small essence of true eloquence, a praise to the Buddha for teaching dependent origination. Actually, I'm just going to go off on a slight tangent here, because that text, I've mentioned this in another class, but not in this class yet. Like that text by Lama Tsongkhapa is quite famous and beautiful. So Tsongkhapa spent many, many years studying the perfection of wisdom, right? And studying emptiness and meditating on emptiness and doing retreats on emptiness. And whenever he had some kind of realization, then he would think, oh, that's not the final realization, right? He kept going, like he would have some kind of realization experientially related to emptiness, but then he would have some doubt. No, I don't think that's the exact final meaning. And so he would do another retreat, and then he would do some study, and then he would have a vision of Manjushri and ask questions, and then he would go back and retreat. And then there was he was in retreat, and the story goes, Thupten Jinpa tells the story this way. He says Tsongkhapa was in retreat, and then he had been meditating on emptiness, and then that night he went to sleep, and he had a dream. And in the dream, he visited Tushita Pure Land, which is the Pure Land the Buddha was in before he came to this planet, and that now Maitreya, the future Buddha, sort of resides in as a teacher. And in Tushita Pure Land, he saw Maitreya sitting around with Nagarjuna, Buddhapalita, Chandrakirti, all the Aryadeva, the great masters of the Majjhimaka tradition. And he, of course, being Tsongkhapa, right, he immediately went towards them. Like he wanted to meet them, because that's what else would Lama Tsongkhapa do but go towards them to meet them. And it said that Buddhapalita, who was one great expounder of the middle way view, and they say Buddhapalita was very tall, dark-skinned Indian man. So anyway, he stood up and he brought his text. It's called the Buddhapalita Commentary. It's the commentary to Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way. So in Tsongkhapa's dream, Buddhapalita came up and met him as he was approaching them, and took the text and put it on top of Tsongkhapa's head to bless him, as is done in Buddhist cultures. And they say that Tsongkhapa, when the text touched his head, felt an overwhelming bliss, and the bliss was so powerful it kind of woke him up. So he woke up in this incredibly blissful, subtle state. And the way Thupten Jinpa tells the story in his biography of Tsongkhapa, he says, so he's in this kind of blissful state, having just woken up, and he hears a knock at his door. And he goes to the door, like of his retreat cabin, little hut or something. And this guy's there, and he says, I brought you this as an offering. And he hands him Buddhapalita's, the exact book that was in his dream, the Buddhapalita Commentary. And so Tsongkhapa feels this is like a good sign, of course, right? Quite a remarkable synchronicity, I guess would be the word that we would use. And he sits down and opens up, in Tibetan, right, the text would be wrapped in cloth. So he has to like untie it, and he unwraps the cloth, and he starts reading it. And he kind of flips open to a certain page, and he reads a line, I think, that says something like, the self is not one with the aggregates, nor is the self different from the aggregates. And they say suddenly he entered into this experience of the perfection of wisdom. Like he entered into a meditative equipoise on emptiness, directly realizing emptiness. And so he had the experience that was just described in the previous page, right? Completely inexpressible by words or thoughts, unproduced and unceasing, like the entity of the sky. Realizing, the object of wisdom of unique knowledge. He had that experience in meditative equipoise. And apparently he stayed in meditation for a while. And then when he came out of his meditative equipoise, he wrote this text. This text that the author here is quoting is the text Tsongkhapa wrote right after he came out of that, and that same day, that morning or whatever. He came out of meditative equipoise, and he wrote this praise to the Buddha for having taught dependent origination. And early in that text, he makes a point. He says, nobody else teaches the meaning of emptiness as dependent origination. There's nobody else in the, history of the world who ever taught that. And he says, if somebody's going to really praise the Buddha wisely, they would praise them for that, for having taught the meaning of dependent origination as emptiness, and emptiness as dependent origination. That was his realization, right? That the meaning of emptiness is dependent arising. And the meaning of dependent arising is emptiness. Anyway, so now there's this quote, right? This one verse from that text. So you can get the sense of the meaning of how profound that text is, though. It's the text that Tsongkhapa wrote that day. So he's saying so Tsongkhapa here is addressing the Buddha, right? This is his praise to the Buddha. So he says, whatever you have spoken begins from dependent arising and is for the purpose of passing beyond sorrow. You have no activities that do not bring peace. And then I'll read Tendar Larampa's commentary to that, at the beginning of it at least. He says, the transcendent victor thinks only of methods by which sentient beings may pass beyond sorrow. And the method by which they pass beyond sorrow is the wisdom realizing emptiness. Therefore, it is called the essence of wisdom. That which passes beyond sorrow is the reality of sentient beings' minds. Therefore, it is called the essence of the Tathagatas, or Buddha nature. Right. So, this is profound. So, first of all, right, he's saying, when he says you have no activities that do not bring peace, right, he's pointing out that all the Buddha's activities are motivated by compassion, right, the wish to free others from suffering, the wish to bring peace. And then he's saying here, what's the most effective, most profound method to bring beings beyond peace? And it's this meaning, dependent origination. Right? And so what he's pointing out also, it's an interesting point. He's saying that all the Buddha's other teachings, and I think it's Chandrakirti says the same thing. He said, and Shantideva says this too. All the other teachings of the Buddha lead to this teaching, right? The teaching of dependent arising. That was what Tsongkhapa realized that day also. That all the other teachings Yeah, Shantideva says that. He says, it's like, and so also part of what Tendar Rinpoche here is saying is when we say the Heart Sutra, right? In a way that this is the heart of the Buddha's teachings. This is the very heart or the very essence. That's what he used the word essence there. Right? This is the essence of the Buddha's teachings. Is this teaching, and what's the meaning that? What's the focus of this teaching, the Heart Sutra? It's dependent arising. Right? And remember, like dependent arising is a synonym in a sense for emptiness, and emptiness is a synonym then for dependent arising. And so the purpose of this, right? So then again, the Buddha's purpose in teaching it is compassion. And actually, we have to pause to think. This is useful to think about. Is the Buddha's compassion includes you, right? So when the Buddha is teaching this sutra, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, is for you, actually, right? It's in other words, what he's saying is another way of saying what did Tsongkhapa say here is that the Buddha saw that each of us is suffering. All sentient beings are suffering, including us, right? And the Buddha wants to free us from our suffering and free others from their suffering. And so how to do that? When the Buddha looked and searched for 3 countless great eons, the point was the Buddha was searching, well, how do I free beings from suffering, right? And what he discovered and taught was it's through this teaching of dependent origination, right, which leads beyond sorrow, the teaching of emptiness, which leads beyond sorrow. And so as we study it, right, connecting back to our motivation, right, it's to free ourselves and others from suffering. Ultimately our wish is to free all sentient beings from suffering. But obviously if we ourselves don't realize the meaning of dependent origination, we can't free somebody else from, but you can't explain we can't lead others to a realization that we don't yet have. So we have to ourselves study this as we're doing together now, gradually realize it in order to then effectively help others. And then I'll just continue on with what Tendar Rinpoche says. He says, when it is understood that everything in the sutras and the tantras, right, meaning that all the Buddhist great treatises, the Sutra and Tantra, only sets forth methods for purifying the taints of sentient beings' minds, it is realized that all the teachings are without contradiction. Therefore, because the Buddhas of the 3 times are born from the wisdom realizing emptiness, that wisdom is referred to with the term mother. And that he's explained the meaning of Bhagavati there in further detail. And then I won't go into detail here. In various places, Tendar Rinpoche talks about and we've talked about this just a little, the different lengths, Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, right? And sometimes there are lists of 17 different Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And, there's a long sutra, which is 100,000 verses. There's the middle one, which is 25,000 verses. There's a short one, which is 8,000 verses. And then the Heart Sutra is like a very abbreviated one. So anyway, we covered that already. But then I wanted to go on a little bit, let's see. Yeah. Oh yeah, we'll cover this too. So then, still on, for those of you who are following in the actual text, on page 10, Tendar Rinpoche, now he's going through something we didn't cover yet, right? So prajna is wisdom, right? And prajna paramita. But the second part of that phrase is paramita. And so now Tendar Rinpoche addresses what is the meaning of paramita. And we covered that a little bit. We'll go through what he says here. So he says, in general, with respect to paramita, going beyond, sometimes it's translated as gone beyond, sometimes it's translated as going beyond, and sometimes it's translated as transcending. I mean, there are different translations, for this Sanskrit phrase, paramita. So he says, in general, with respect to paramita, going beyond a common being is a superior, arya. Beyond the conventional is the ultimate. Beyond samsara is nirvana, and beyond ignorance is knowledge. So let's pause there, right? So he's saying, in a way, right, he's getting it. So the phrase paramita means gone beyond, right? Or transcending something or going beyond something. And so he's saying, it's important here, he's saying in general, right? So he's not yet getting to prajna paramita. First he's saying in general, what is paramita? And what's being gotten beyond, right? And so he's saying, first of all, superior mean arya. We covered this once before, right? So an arya being is someone who's seen emptiness directly. I think that's very funny, isn't it? Like, so I always say that, like, common being, right? Ordinary. Like, so from a Buddhist perspective, like childish beings or ordinary beings are beings who have not yet seen emptiness directly. Uh, so that'd be like most people we've met, most people we've known. Uh, Actually, there's a beautiful text in Buddhism where it talks about the Buddha is talking about the cause of faults, and he says one of the causes, or I can't remember if it's the Buddha or another author, but anyway, the Buddhist master says one of the causes of faults is spending too much time with non-Aryas, with those who have not seen emptiness directly. So that's funny, isn't it? Like, if you think about it for a moment, because it would mean spending all your time with people like Khensa Rinpoche if you wanted to be free from that, or Lama Zopa Rinpoche, or as well as the Dalai Lama, or something, which would be quite a good cause for not having faults, wouldn't it? So it was good advice, I thought. But anyway, so there are common beings, right? And then there are superior beings. So one meaning of gone beyond is you're going beyond being a common being to becoming someone who's seen emptiness, reality directly. Another is beyond the conventional, meaning conventional, right? The two truths. Beyond the conventional level of truth, which is deceptive, is the ultimate level of truth, which is non-deceptive. Then he says beyond samsara, right? So one can go beyond. So one can go beyond the conventional to the ultimate. Then he says one can go beyond samsara to realize nirvana. And then he says, or another meaning of going beyond ignorance is wisdom knowledge. I'll call that wisdom or knowledge. Now he says, from among these different meanings of paramita, the last is the referent to the term wisdom gone beyond, right? So the prajna paramita means specifically what's being gotten beyond is ignorance. And what brings you beyond that is wisdom or knowledge. Now he says, according to Chitamatrans, the wisdom of the non-duality of subject and object, that is the marvelous realization of one's own purpose, refers explicitly to the Sugata. There he's just getting he says a couple things. This is just getting at what I pointed out earlier, which is that according to Chitamatrans, or mind-only school, the meaning here of prajnaparamita, the actual meaning of prajnaparamita is the mind of a Buddha, right? So he says, that's where he says, it refers explicitly to the Sugata. Sugata means one gone to bliss, which is a reference to the Buddha. So to Chitamatrans, the actual final meaning of the term prajnaparamita is the mind of a Buddha. But again, like I said, followers of Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna, the middle way school, they say it's also that it includes the mind of a Buddha, but also the mind of Arya Bodhisattvas when they're in meditative equipoise, directly realizing emptiness. And that was Khensa Rinpoche's position when he taught the Heart Sutra. He said, because he was following the Madhyamaka school. So his position was, any being, essentially, that the final reference to that term, prajnaparamita, what does it mean? Is that under the influence of bodhicitta motivation, someone has a direct realization of emptiness. Direct, as that verse said earlier. That's the real meaning of prajnaparamita. And everything else is like analogous to, so if we meditate on emptiness, if we generate the best we can bodhicitta, and then meditate on emptiness correctly as best we can, that's not the actual prajnaparamita, but it's analogous to, or it tends towards, it's leading us towards the prajnaparamita experience. Gyumei Khensa Rinpoche said, when you're practicing prajnaparamita, he said, like, even asking questions is a practice of prajnaparamita. If you meditate on emptiness, or if you study it, if you contemplate it, if you think deeply about it, if you ask questions about it, if you pursue it, those are all practices leading towards that experience. And again, that's why I'm using that analogy of like the unripe fruit. And I think it's useful to view ourselves like that. Like, in other words, to actually think like I am like, that I'm like an unripe fruit. And each time you meditate on emptiness, each time you contemplate emptiness, each time you cultivate bodhicitta, right, and then think about wisdom, you're like ripening yourself, right? You're helping yourself to mature into a better kind of spiritual being, in a sense. So that's our task, and and even in studying this text, that's what we're trying to do, right? Is we're together we're trying to help ourselves and each other to ripen, right? To better come closer to that experience, which takes time. Okay. now we're going to go back into the prologue of the actual sutra in a second. So maybe I'll pause there and just check if anybody, though, I just was covering some general points there, but then does anybody have any questions? So, and you can just unmute yourself, I think, Cynthia. Or do I have to do it? I'm not sure. Are you able to? Or I can do it here. Or Dundrup, is there a way to let her unmute? I think Dundrup has a setting. Oh,
okay.
Oh, there it goes.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify on the, she said you have to have like bodhicitta motivation, right? So is that even if you're not a ripe fruit, you do need, is that a prerequisite? Like you have to have that good motivation, right, for it to be considered prajna paramita practice?
Yeah, I think one way of saying it is without, like if somebody doesn't have bodhicitta, they can still have prajna, actually. They can still have wisdom, but it's not the wisdom, but it won't serve as the, I guess one point is it won't, if you think of the Chitta, let's take the Chitta Matran's position for a second, right? Their view is that like only the wisdom mind of a Buddha is prajna paramita. And in a way, they're making a profound point, which is like that, prajna paramita is what gives, ultimately it's what gives birth to the Buddhas, right? And so if we don't have bodhicitta motivation, then the realization of emptiness, like in the mind of, say, for example, like a arhat has realized emptiness without bodhicitta motivation. And that person, their realization of emptiness in and of itself won't bring them to Buddhahood, right? Because you have to have bodhicitta. So the prajna paramita is one of the 6 perfections. And the 6 perfections, their intent is to give rise to a Buddha, actually to transform an ordinary being into a Buddha. And so only practices done with bodhicitta motivation, another way, actually, yeah, so one point is only practices done with bodhicitta motivation serve that function. Only they can lead a being to Buddhahood. And I'll make another point, actually, which Tendar Lama doesn't cover in detail, but Gyume Khenpo has said this before, is, like, because I think this gets it in a way at a deeper part of what you're getting, your question is getting at, Cynthia, which is, ordinary people and, hearers and solitary realizer practitioners and all kinds of people can practice, if you think of the 6 perfections, can practice patience. Everybody can, all kinds of people practice some generosity, right? Give to charity or something like that. And those things, it's an interesting point. Like, so say an ordinary person who doesn't cultivate bodhicitta gives to charity. That's generosity for sure, right? And generosity is good karma, but it's not the perfection of generosity. And if somebody understands emptiness, but without bodhicitta, that's wisdom, but it's not the perfection of wisdom. And what Gyume Khenpo pointed out, and also Lama Tsongkhapa points this out too, he says, what makes something a perfection, like what makes generosity into the perfection of generosity? And then they say, ideally, it should be, actually Gyume Khenpo was quite funny. He said, ideally, it should be, there's bodhicitta motivation, and one's action is influenced also by wisdom. So when a person's giving, right, they have bodhicitta motivation, and then they have some reflection in their mind, at least intellectually, that this is dependently arisen, right? That the giver, that the gift can only be given because the giver, the gift, and the recipient are all interdependent, and so none exist inherently. And if the person gives with bodhicitta motivation and that kind of, at least intellectual understanding, then that's the perfection of generosity, not just generosity. Then Khenpo Rinpoche said, well, and even if the person doesn't have wisdom, if they at least have bodhicitta, then it's okay to call it perfection of generosity. It's not like the ideal form of the perfection of generosity, but it's, you can still call it that in a way. Or the same with patience or ethics, and so the same would go. So then with going back, so now when it comes to prajna paramita, you can have prajna, you can have wisdom. If somebody just meditates on emptiness without, let's say the person just wants to achieve their own liberation, so they don't have bodhicitta. Or they're a professor and they want to get tenure, so they go off to meditate on emptiness. That wouldn't be the perfection of wisdom. It would be, they could gain some kind of wisdom, of study or contemplating, but for it to be prajna paramita, right? The paramita part means it has to be under the influence of bodhicitta. Does that get it?
Yeah, can I say that then, that you will never ripen if you don't have bodhicitta? Can I say it that way?
Yeah, you won't ripen
Okay.
into a Buddha without bodhicitta, for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Lauren, I have a question. Sorry, I don't have my video on. This is Sarah.
Sarah, oh, hey.
So you have been mentioning, I get very confused because there are so many different names for so many different, achievements and whatever. And you were mentioning an Arya Bodhisattva, and I wonder how that's different from sort of like a fully awakened Buddha, because in my mind, like Arya is like wisdom and Bodhisattva is Bodhisattva, and if you put them together, that sort of is a Buddha. So what is the difference?
That's a great question. And so, first of all, I'll say one thing. One thing is that we'll cover that in a lot. I mean, the sutra itself will cover that in detail later on, in a lot of detail, actually. But in a brief answer, at least for now, like, let's see, I'm thinking how, I don't know how, I'm trying to decide how brief to be, but I guess I'll say it this way. Like, if you think, maybe I'll say it this way, that like this will be covered in detail in the sutra, but more later. But on the path to Buddhahood, they say, that we say overall, there, if somebody's trying to become a Buddha, that they, so a Bodhisattva, that they go through 5 paths, or you could say them like 5, they're 5 sequential stages in a way. And so the first stage, right, when somebody just, they generate uncontrived bodhicitta, so that means like the person has actually realized bodhicitta. And what does that, that means like the person is not like, I should go through a little detail about this because I think it's important. Is like, if we generate bodhicitta through effort, right? Like if you wake up in the morning and you're not immediately overwhelmed by bodhicitta motivation, right? You're like that. You're not yet a bodhisattva, but we can if we've understood bodhicitta and we've studied it, we've meditated on it some, then through effort we can generate a kind of bodhicitta motivation. But there comes a point when you do that over and over again. Through practice, where it becomes effortless and spontaneous, right? Because your mind's familiar with it, just like with anything, right? If your mind becomes totally familiar with something, then it becomes spontaneous. So when somebody realizes a level of bodhicitta where it's spontaneous and natural and effortless, then at that point, that person has has become a bodhisattva and has entered the path of accumulation, which is the first of the 5 paths. But that person has not yet realized emptiness directly, and they start studying emptiness through their bodhicitta motivation. They study emptiness, they contemplate emptiness, they, they can do some kind of, mostly study and contemplation. They do a little bit of meditation on emptiness. And then there comes a point where the second path is the path of preparation. And that person has already been on the path of accumulation, and then they achieve what's called the union of calm abiding and special insight. So they have a very deep meditative experience of emptiness, but it's not yet a direct realization. And then they keep meditating on emptiness with this kind of very deep meditative experience, and they're getting closer and closer to realizing emptiness non-conceptually, but there's a kind of subtle conceptuality still in their mind that's not direct realization. And now this gets to your question. So then on the third path is the path of seeing. And there, that person who's been on, the bodhisattva who's been on the path of preparation, finally kind of breaks through, like Tsongkhapa did on that day, I described. And they directly realize emptiness, totally without any conceptuality, without any experience of subject and object. They say sometimes like water poured into water, their mind and emptiness experientially totally merge. And it's a totally unmitigated experience of emptiness. But now this gets at your question. So what's the difference between that and a Buddha, right? And so according to the Mahayana teachings, that person now has, this direct experience of emptiness. They're an Arya. At that point, the person became an Arya. Means because the meaning of Arya is that they have the wisdom directly realizing emptiness. They've had that experience. But according to the Mahayana teachings, that person is just on the first of the 10 bhumis, which is the path of is achieved on the path of seeing. And when they're in the experience of emptiness, they have no conceptuality. They have no while they're in that experience, they certainly have no mental afflictions. But when they come out of that experience, they're still not entirely familiar with it. And so when they come out of that experience, again, things appear to them as if they had inherent existence, actually. They don't believe that appearance anymore, but it still appears to them that way. And so that person, is an Arya Bodhisattva, but there are a few things. One is they're not yet omniscient like a Buddha. In other words, they still have the obstacles to omniscience. But at that point, on the first bhumi and the first 8 bhumis, actually, bhumis means like levels. So bodhisattvas will gradually progress. They still have subtle mental afflictions even when they're not in meditative equipoise. Their mental afflictions are very weak. They're not like ours. They don't have like overwhelming experiences of them. But they're said to still have like some level of mental afflictions in their experience. And they still are not totally skilled in helping others. They're much more skilled than we would be at helping other sentient beings. But so those bodhisattvas on those the first to the 8th bhumis, from the first bhumi they go into the 4th path of meditation. And they're using that wisdom directly realizing emptiness to gradually, first of all, they familiarize their mind with it. They practice all the different perfections, giving, ethics, generosity and ethics, and patience, and joyous effort, and meditative concentration, and wisdom. And what they're doing there is they're accumulating merit. They're gradually eliminating from grosser to subtler and subtler levels of mental afflictions. And so they have to eliminate all those subtle levels through that wisdom of these kind of mental afflictions. And then they have to eliminate also the obstacles to omniscience. And what happens also is they become more and more skilled at helping others during those phases. So they're using that wisdom to eliminate their own subtle mental afflictions, to eliminate then their obstacles to omniscience, and to become more skilled and more available and more effective at benefiting others. So that's the difference between an Arya, so somebody who's an Arya Bodhisattva, that starts right on the path of seeing when they first directly realize emptiness. But in a way, even that person, you could say, has to then familiarize and use that wisdom. And it's an interesting point though, like the wisdom itself, that experience is completely correct. So it's not that their experience of emptiness becomes better somehow later, but it's that they become more able to, through familiarization, they become able to use that wisdom to more deeply affect themselves. So that's a difference. Does that fully answer your question, or is there anything else?
No, yeah, that's very helpful. So then you said there are 5 stages. You mentioned the first 4. Is the 5th stage then full Buddhahood?
Yeah, they call it the path of no more learning. That's the 5th, and that's the Buddhahood. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, any other questions?
Just a quick question.
Sure, Will.
It's page, you talk about page 9 and 10.
Uh-huh.
I haven't gotten there yet. I see a lot of words, but I don't see where you're talking about. Is it just for me to go through it so I can dig it out, or am I?
You can't find maybe you printed out in the PDF. I have you have Tendar Larampa's text.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you look on page 9, where I was quoting like that verse from Rahula, I'll hold it up here. There's a thing that says number 1, the preliminary stanzas, and then it's right under that. It's bold-faced. It says the preliminary stanzas on page 9, and then it has that verse. I bow to the mother of the conquerors and 3 times. So it's like a little more than halfway down the page under a bold face that says number 1. That's number 1, the preliminary stanzas. And then I went on from there to from that verse and then into page 10.
Yeah, I must have the wrong one. Okay, I will look it up. Okay, thank you.
But yeah, it's on the website and it's free to download. Anybody can download it. It's right there. It's on the Guhyas Mahasana's website under the Heart Sutra class.
Thank you.
Let's see. Okay. Any other question, or should I go on? Okay. Let's see. So now we're going to return to the prologue. in the actual sutra, but also we'll follow Tendal Rampa's commentary somewhat to that. But before we do, actually, I want to go back. Like last time I talked about, I started, so we were covering the actual sutra then, right? And so we covered, this first stanza of the sutra. And I want to just go back and mention one other point, which I thought was just interesting. I was looking back at some old notes, and just regarding that phrase, "Thus did I hear it one time." I'd said a lot of things about it last class. I'm not going to repeat them all. But I was looking back at my notes, and one time, many years ago, Geshe Sogo, Jeff, I think you were there. Geshe Soga taught the Heart Sutra at Guya Samaja Center. And he had another, there are a lot of different ways to, think about that verse, or that line, "Thus did I hear one time." And he added one, I said most of them last time, but he added one point that was unique, that I hadn't seen it somewhere else, where he said also you can take that as a reminder of impermanence. I thought that was an interesting point. And he was saying, because "thus did I hear it one time" also implies that it was after the Buddha had died, that this was, that most of the sutras, I guess it was Ananda, then recited. And so it's a reminder that even Geshe Soga said when he would, read that line in various sutras, because that is the beginning of every sutra, right? "Thus did I hear it one time." He was saying that one could take that as a reminder of impermanence, like we started our meditation with today, where a person, you could think, wow, life is short, even the Buddha passed away, I should make good use of my life. And so he was saying that's another way to take that line, as a reminder of that even the Buddha passed out of this world, that I also will pass out of this world. And so I should use my time well and meaningfully, and to practice the Dharma of the Buddha. And that even the Buddha's Dharma will pass away eventually. It doesn't last forever. Everything, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. Right? And so I will pass, the Buddha's teachings will pass, while they are here and I'm here, I should practice them. So he was saying that's another gloss on, or sort of way to think about that line. But then, so we covered that that first section for the most part, but I'll just go through a couple of points that that Tendal Rampa says. Most of what he says I had already covered, but I'm going to go down. I'm going to go down near the bottom of page 11 just to make a couple points I didn't make last time, and then we'll go on from there. And these are just things that Tendal Rampa points out. One is, so in that very first paragraph of the sutra, it said, there's this line, the Bhagavan was dwelling on Mass Vulture's Mountain in Rajgriha together with a great community of monks. And Tendal Rampa makes a few points there. He says regarding monk, first he says the actuality of monkhood can be attained in any of 10 ways of receiving ordination. In this context, it refers to an arhat. So he makes a couple points. One is, in general, monk means somebody who has ordination, right? Who has taken ordination. And then he says, there are 10 ways of taking ordination. Those are taught in the Vinaya, so we won't go into those in detail. But in general, nowadays, right, actually, I will say this point, though, that to take ordination, now one has to take it from somebody else who has ordination, right? And ideally, if you're in a central land, there should be, I think, 10. But if you're in a kind of remote area, it could be fewer number of monks, if you're a monk, then it has to be for monks. If you're going to be a fully ordained nun, there has to be fully ordained nuns there, and so on. There are all kinds of rules in the monastic tradition, but it's not something you can just do on your own. In other words, you have to receive it from it goes in a lineage back to the Buddha himself, actually. Like with the Bodhisattva vow, it's good to take it from a person, but you can actually take it you can just sit in front of the visualized image of the Buddha ultimately and take it if you need to. But monk vows, you can't do that, and nun vows, you can't do that. So anyway, he says, in general, to become, I guess the sutra itself says monk. So regarding monk, in general, it refers to somebody who's received ordination. But then he says, in this context, it specifically refers to an arhat. And so it's saying that when the sutra was taught, the group of, where it says the great community of monks, that they were arhats. And then the great community of bodhisattvas were mostly lay bodhisattvas. Like you see them in the drawings, right, where they're wearing these silken clothes and things like that. And then I saw in one of the question and answer sessions in one of the commentaries, it said, somebody said, well, so the Geshe who was teaching it, they said, well, does that mean that none of the monks there were Bodhisattvas? And then the Geshe said, no, of course some of them could have been. It's just giving a general point that there were this community of monks who were like famous arhats who followed the Buddha everywhere and were often with him. And then the Bodhisattvas were like Avalokiteshvara, and who's mentioned in the Sutra, but also Manjushri and other great Bodhisattvas, Vajrapani and so on. And then Tendar Larampa quotes Shantideva, and I just thought this important quote to make. It says, monkhood is the root of the teaching, but even monkhood is difficult. And that point is mentioned a lot also in the Lamrim. It's taught by, and particularly in the text, Lamrim, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand by Pabonka Rinpoche. But other texts say this too. In other words, that one point is like, that the ordained Sangha, monkhood is the root of the teaching, meaning that the existence of the ordained Sangha is essential to the continued existence of Buddhism. And I'll say that, in part because it's an important thing for us to remember, that, for the Dharma to continue to exist, actually in the Sutrayana teachings, it says that, right, that the ordained Sangha must exist. And then in Tantra, actually, there's a saying that as long as the Guhya Samaja Tantra is taught and exists, then the Tantras will continue to exist on the planet. That if the ordained traditions were to completely die out, then in a sense, Buddhism would die out on this planet, will at some point die out. And then they say also, if the Guhya Samaja Tantra were to die out, then the Tantras will die out on this planet. And so I just mentioned that because one is Shantideva says it, and the other is, it's partly to also remember that that respect for the ordained community is really important. That makes sense. They're in this sutra. They're there. The Buddha was an ordained monk. There were a group of monks, and I assume nuns. I'm not sure. It doesn't say in the sutra, but in general, there are nuns too, of course, who are important, and that the existence of monks and nuns is essential to the continued existence of the Dharma on the planet. And so, when we have the opportunity to offer support to monks and nuns or to do things like that, that's helping the Dharma to continue to exist in this world. So that's the quote from Shantideva. Then it says, he says, the Sangha is a gathering of 4 or more monks. And then he gives an interesting point I had not seen in another text. I'll just mention it. He says, he gives an etymology of the word Sangha. And he's saying, it means not to be separated by demons from the teacher, Buddha, the teaching of the excellent doctrine, and the friends who practice purity. And then he quotes Chandrakirti's 70 stanzas on refuge. It says, because they cannot be separated from the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha by billions of demons, they are called Sangha. And I wanted to make a point about that, because in that sense, right, actually in Buddhism, right, demons, like we went over this, there are 4 maras, right? And only one of them is external. Most of them are internal, right? So our own mental, so I want to emphasize that. What does it mean to, that we all, it'd be good for us all to try to be Sangha, as best we can. I mean, ideally one, monks and nuns are represent the Sangha, Aryas are the ultimate Sangha. But for each of us, right, what does it mean not to allow demons to separate us or separate one from the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha? The demons, the most important demons are our own mental afflictions, right? And they do separate us sometimes from the Sangha, from the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, right? From virtuous friends. In other words, when you're, what's the word? Our own craving or addiction or anger or attachment, when it pulls us away from our practice, that's a demon pulling us away from the Dharma, right? And so I just want to emphasize that. So, these Sangha were quite were quite effective at that, right? At not being pulled away from the refuges, but we all have to practice that. Does that make sense? So this idea, I think that word demons is provocative and interesting, right? But we all have our own demons, is the idea. Until you're a Buddha, right, you have some demons. So we should not allow our demons to pull us away from the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha in our lives, is what the sutras, what Tendar Larampa's quote is getting at there, I think. And so now, I think we already covered this part. We're great. So yeah, I'm going to focus now on the next verse. So it says, I'll read it and then we'll go over it in detail. It says also, so we finished the previous verse now, right? So the Bhagavan, so you have the scene, right? The Buddha is sitting on this mountain called Massive Vultures Mountain in Rajgriha. He's surrounded by a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. Right? We said great community can mean, and particularly with the great community of monks, they gloss that as meaning a large community. Right? But when they say great community of bodhisattvas, they say particularly great in that context means having a great mind, right? Ultimate, and meaning a great mind of compassion, right? And the Bhagavan, right? So the Buddha was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception, right? So the Buddha was absorbed in a meditative equipoise on emptiness. And now it says, also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. So we'll talk about that paragraph now a little bit, because that's where we're up to. We'll get back to the $10 Rampa's text in a second. I want to just make a few general points, right? So obviously you have your scene now, right? That the Buddha's there, there's this great assembly, and then, we're particularly focusing on the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara. And I want to focus a little bit on these phrases, right? There's words that are applying to this Bodhisattva, right? So first, he's called Bodhisattva, right? And so, I already gave, actually, a couple minutes ago, I gave kind of definition of what, in a simple sense, a Bodhisattva is somebody who has realized bodhicitta. Right? And that's a simple definition in a way, right? A being who has actualized bodhicitta, right? And again, that actualized means it's effortless, right? It means that, and I'm just going to go off on a little bit of a tangent for a second on this point. Like, because of the nature of mind, right? Because the mind is empty of inherent existence, whatever we familiarize our mind with can become totally spontaneous, natural, and so on. And actually, I often think about this. I'll say it, like, if you look around the world, like, actually, like, you can see the truth of this, that whatever people become familiarized with becomes spontaneous. Because if you look around the world, right, there are people, actually it's true, right? There are people who, like, totally spontaneously and continuously, almost every, continuously every day, right? Every hour, their mind is totally overwhelmed with desire, right? Like somebody who's completely addicted to something, right? That they, like, their mind is like, and what they're like, so for example, and I've thought about this, and it's like, well, sometimes like what somebody else is addicted to, then to you would seem totally uninteresting, right? But that other person, like, if you said to them for one day, you can't have that, they would completely freak out, right? And like, their mind is totally absorbed in that, right? Because they've familiarized their mind with that, their mind and their body with that thing, right? And then there are people who are so angry, right? That like, they wake up angry, and like the slightest trigger, they feel enraged, and like anger is like their baseline state, right? And then there are other people who worry, right? Like, like they can't sleep at night because they're up all night worrying. They wake up in the middle of the night worrying. They wake up in the morning, like, like overwhelmed with worry, right? And all day it's there, and the person who, and it's interesting, right? The person who say, they're different is my point, right? Like, in other words, the angry person may not have any addiction, and the worried person may not have, be so angry, and so on. It's whatever that person's being has become totally familiar with, right? It becomes spontaneous and natural, right? Like where it can even wake them up out of their sleep. Does that make sense? It's that powerful. And actually it's true, isn't it? Like worry can do that, but anger can do that too. You know, right? Some people can be so angry they can't sleep at night, right? And like they're up thinking about whoever they're angry at and so on. So whatever state your mind gets familiarized with becomes natural and spontaneous and eventually overwhelming, right? And what I'm getting at, this is my own aside on this point about bodhisattva, is a bodhisattva, right, is somebody who's done that with regards to bodhicitta. Does that make sense? Can you imagine that, right? Where your experience of bodhicitta is that, like, if you think of somebody, you know, if you think of like, you know, somebody in the worst throes of addiction, right? How much desire they have and how much craving they have and how much addiction. A bodhisattva is somebody whose bodhicitta is as familiar to their mind as the other. Does that make sense? Doesn't mean their mind is peaceful, because bodhicitta is a peaceful state, but it's that familiar. Does that make sense? And I sometimes joke about that in our culture, we don't have words for that, right? Like, or I would sometimes say like, you know, what's the word? Like a rage of compassion. Like the bodhisattva has this like overwhelming experience. It's like totally overwhelms their being. You know, so that's a bodhisattva, right? It's somebody who, you know, as they fall asleep at night, bodhicitta is there. In their dreams, bodhicitta is there. When they wake up in the morning, that's their baseline state. And that's not like some miraculous blessing or something. I mean, in a way it's a blessing, but it's actually comes about through familiarization and effort. So you could become a bodhisattva. Also, we can, I can, you know, we all can, if we familiarize our mind with bodhicitta. And that's the only way to become a bodhisattva, is to familiarize, to again and again sort of cultivate bodhicitta until it becomes spontaneous, and to sort of, you know, remind ourselves about it and think about it and infuse our being with bodhicitta over and over and over. And, you know, Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche said, you know, there's artificial bodhicitta, which means it comes about through a bunch of effort. And he said, but every bodhisattva began with artificial bodhicitta. There's nobody who is a bodhisattva where it just happened out of the blue. Like, in other words, that they had to generate it artificially or effortfully, and then by doing that over and over again, it eventually became totally spontaneous. And so in one sense, what's a bodhisattva is somebody like that. So Avalokiteshvara is like that. Does that make sense? Then, just to clarify a little further, in terms of this actual phrase though, bodhisattva, Bodhi, right, is, you know, the same root, or same as Buddha, you know, like the Buddha under the Bodhi tree and so on. So you can, Bodhi in Sanskrit can mean, like I said this last time, it can mean, or first class, it can mean awakened, or there's also a gloss on the etymology. It can be like a flower opening, like a budding, you know, so opening. So awakening or opening like a flower. So, but then when we say, so what does that mean? So we're going to go through Bodhi and then Sattva. So, and actually I covered this in the first class. So the first meaning, and in Tibetan is Jang Chup. So in Tibetan it's quite easy because the Jang has one referent and the Chup has another. Whereas Bodhi has these two meanings, to awaken or to flower, I'm going to call it. But the two meanings of Bodhi and the meaning of Jang and Chup correlate. And so I'll use Bodhi. So the meaning awaken means to awaken from all ignorance, right? So it means to kind of wake up and leave behind all afflictions, all negativities. And then the second meaning of flowering means like to give rise to all good qualities of love, compassion, knowledge, wisdom, and so on, right? So the Bodhisattva is intent upon that, right? They're intent upon achieving that state of Bodhi. And what is that state of Bodhi? It's a state where all negative qualities have been overcome and all good qualities have been fully developed. So the Bodhisattva is intent on Buddhahood, or Bodhi, which is has those qualities. And then this phrase Sattva, which in Tibetan is Sempa, Thupten Jinpa translates it as heroic being, which is kind of a nice phrase, or courageous being, you could say. And so Sattva means, refers to a being or a person who's heroic or who's courageous, right? And there is like that compassion, right, the practice of compassion and the practice of transformation on the path to Buddhahood takes courage, right? It takes bravery. The bravery of being willing, actually there are many kinds of bravery it takes, right? One is being willing to face the suffering, right? Because compassion means you look at suffering and you look at it honestly. Another is you have to be courageous because you have to be willing to make effort, right? There's the path to enlightenment is not some like, it doesn't just happen, it takes effort, it takes hard work, it takes a willingness to, like, first of all, to learn, you know, to learn the Dharma, but also like to face hard truths about ourselves, to look inside ourselves, to admit our own faults to ourselves, you know, and maybe to others too, but especially to ourselves. Like, and that takes courage, doesn't it? Like, I think, yeah, anyway, so that definitely takes, all those things take courage, right? And then, you know, the practices of bodhisattvas, right, that take time and take effort over a long period of time. Again, they all take courage and take effort. So a bodhisattva, you could say, is like a heroic being intent upon enlightenment. So that's the meaning of bodhisattva. And then it says Avalokiteshvara is, you know, the bodhisattva mahasattva. And so, so what is this? So we can, let's talk just for a moment about that phrase, right? Mahasattva. So maha in Sanskrit means great, right? Like Mahayana means great vehicle. And Mahasattva means great heroic being, right? So he's not just a heroic, compassion, you know, a heroic being intent upon enlightenment, but he's a great heroic being. And so Lama translate in his text quotes a line that says, "Why is he great? He is great because he will lead a great collection of beings out of suffering." Right? And so, like a great being in that sense, that his scope is great, his compassion is great, his compassion encompasses all beings, and he'll succeed in benefiting a great collection of beings. So that's the meaning of Mahasattva, according to the Dalai Lama's commentary. And then, actually, I'm going to go further on that point of the Mahasattva, because that was the Dalai Lama kind of gave that simple interpretation of Mahasattva. And actually, I was thinking about, just going on a side here, I was thinking of this phrase Mahasattva. The Maha, the Sanskrit, is the same as Mahayana. It's also the same Maha as in Mahatma, like, you know, like a great Maha, they sometimes translate that great soul or something, but here's Mahasattva. But there's another commentary on the Heart Sutra by Indian master Vimalamitra, and he goes further into this Maha. So I'm just going to share his reflections on it because they're more detailed. And he says, great can refer to the Maha, great there, can refer to three different greatnesses. One is he has a great intention, which makes him the supreme among all sentient beings. And why is that? Why is his intention great? First of all, because his intention is to free all beings, the greatest possible number. And secondly, like his greatness is intent upon a great result, Buddhahood, right? So there's a great scope, or a great heart, you could call it, right? That encompasses all sentient beings. Then also, Mahasattva is great because he has great abandonment, meaning he's abandoned all the flaws, all the flaws of a samsaric being, or many of the flaws of samsaric being. And then great realization is the third meaning of great, right? That he's realized, the paths and the grounds of a bodhisattva, so his realizations are also great. And then similar meaning on sattva. He says, Vimalamitra says, he's called sattva because his intention for enlightenment is because he has an intention for enlightenment, and because the mind is the mind of enlightenment, meaning bodhicitta, so he's heroic because he has bodhicitta. And then he says, what is that? And then Vimalamitra says, what is that enlightenment that he's intent upon? And then he says, enlightenment has the nature of space, or like space. It is the abandonment of all conceptual thoughts of true inherent existence. So, those are different glosses on this meaning of Mahasattva. Then so this is all describing Avalokiteshvara, right? Then it says Arya, right? So we've covered what is an Arya. An Arya is somebody who's seen reality directly, right? So Avalokiteshvara is such a being. And then Avalokiteshvara, right, is the next word. And the word, so this is a reference to we sometimes say actually it's an interesting point, like in Tantra, Avalokiteshvara is considered a Buddha. In the Tantra context, we say Buddha Avalokiteshvara. He's the embodiment of all the Buddha's compassion. In Sanskrit Dharma says, well, this is a sutra. And so he says, so here in this context, we should think of Avalokiteshvara as a 10th Bhumi Bodhisattva, or as manifesting in the aspect of a 10th Bhumi Bodhisattva. If you think of him as a Buddha, then he's in the aspect of a 10th Bhumi Bodhisattva. So 10th Bhumi is the Bhumi just before Buddhahood. So, as in this context, you would think of him as a Bodhisattva who's, in his final life before becoming a Buddha, he's eliminated all the mental afflictions, he's achieved limitless good qualities, and he's sort of, on the final stage of the Bodhisattva path before achieving the path of no more learning, Buddhahood itself. And then I want to go through, though, his name, Avalokiteshvara, in Tibetan Chenrezig, which I'm sure most of you have heard. And I said last time, Avalokiteshvara is like the patron saint of Tibet. They say that Manjushri is the patron saint of China, the patron bodhisattva maybe and Avalokiteshvara is the patron bodhisattva of Tibet. He sort of vowed to the Buddha to help the Tibetans and to help the world, though. But his name is quite beautiful, and so Avalokite, in Sanskrit, means, like, there are different ways, different Lama Zopa translates that as the compassionate-eyed one. Or some people translate it as like the one who looks with eyes of compassion, which I think is beautiful, isn't it? Like, because you can think, it's a way he sees others through eyes of compassion. And there are many different, I'm just going to go off on a little side here, right? There are many different forms in Tibetan Buddhism that Avalokiteshvara takes, right? There's the two-armed, one face and two arms. There are various forms like that. There's a four-armed, there's Gyawa Gyatso, which I forget how many arms he has, but then there's a very famous form of Avalokiteshvara with 1,000 arms and 1,000 eyes, right? And each, so that form of Avalokiteshvara, he has 1,000 arms reaching out, and each of those has an eye on the palm, and then he has 11 heads also. And actually, do you know that story? Like, there's a famous story that he had vowed, he was so compassionate, right? When he was earlier in his path, or, his guru, actually the top of those 11 heads is Amitabha's head, because his guru is Amitabha Buddha. There's a famous story of Avalokiteshvara that says that he had vowed, he felt so much compassion that he vowed, he said, if I ever give up on helping sentient beings, may my head burst to pieces and may my body shatter, something like that. And then they say he worked for others countless, for over a very long time and was benefiting beings very effectively, and like kind of was doing it without break. And then they say at a certain point, he paused to look around, and he saw that although he had benefited many beings, that there were still infinite beings suffering. And he felt hopeless in that moment. And in that moment of hopelessness, it was like he started to despair. And in his despair, his head and body exploded. And then the story goes that Amitabha, his guru, came and said, kind of like, don't worry, Avalokiteshvara. I'm here, and he said, and I'm going to transform, your shattered head into 11 heads, and your shattered body will now have 1,000 arms, so that you could even more effectively see the suffering of others, right, with the 1,000 eyes, and have 1,000 arms to reach out to the suffering of others and help them. And I'm pausing on that story for a moment because I think, it's a unique story to Avalokiteshvara, but it also gets at something archetypal, I think, which is, you know, there are times, and I think this is one of those times in the world, right, where we might have moments feeling a little bit like Avalokiteshvara did in that moment. You know, if you try really hard to, you know, and are with a few other people maybe who try hard to make the world a better place, and then you look and you see so much suffering in the world, and it can seem despairing, or it can seem hopeless, I think, at moments to people. And I think there's something heartening in Avalokiteshvara's story. You know, first of all, that Avalokiteshvara himself felt the same way for a moment can be a little comforting. Even the Buddha of compassion, you know, felt a moment of despair at the suffering, you know, that people cause, right? That we cause, you know, we as human beings cause so much unbearable suffering. And, you know, you get a sense in Avalokiteshvara's story of his heart breaking open, right? He fell apart, right? You know, that compassion is like that, right? You know, compassion feels the suffering of others. And Avalokiteshvara obviously felt the suffering of others very deeply, as I think some of you do. And I think that story, I'm going off on, it's a little bit of a tangent. It's not, this sutra doesn't particularly mention the 1,000-arm version, but it's Avalokiteshvara, right? And, you know, I think there are a couple of things. One is like, Avalokiteshvara had a teacher, you know, that created a safe context for his practice. I think we all need safe contexts, and, you know, and that we need wisdom. He had a wise teacher, right? And we're studying the Prajnaparamita, so it's about, you know, that compassion. One point is that compassion has to be combined with wisdom, doesn't it, to be effective. And then another point, though, is that that I think Avalokiteshvara's story, for me at least, this is my own reflection now, sort of gets at is that it's okay, you know, to feel the suffering. It's okay to let it even at times sort of feel broken because of it. You know, I sometimes say, like, you know, if you're compassionate, that's a good thing, isn't it? And so I think that's not a reason. I guess what I'm getting at in a way is that's not a reason to be discouraged. And that breaking open of your heart, maybe, in compassion, actually enhances. That's what that story embodies, right? Avalokiteshvara let himself, I think, over and over again. You know, there's that other story, right? He was so overwhelmed with the suffering of others. You can imagine with 1,000 eyes, when he started crying, there'd be a lot of water. That he cried so much, you know, at the suffering of others. He was so overwhelmed that he wept and wept, that a pool formed, you know, and then from that pool, a lotus came and opened, and green Tara appeared, right? The female Buddha of active compassion. She said, "Don't worry, brother, I'll help you. Together we'll work to make the world a better place." And I guess what I'm getting at there is I think Avalokiteshvara as a bodhisattva, those stories embody something very beautiful, which is like, you know, he's not some distant creature, you know, floating in space. He's someone who cries and who breaks apart because he's so intimate with the suffering of others. You know, when you see the Dalai Lama, he cries so easily, right? If you watch videos of him, or if you're around, I mean, he cries quite often. You know, in other words, there's an intimacy with the suffering of others in Avalokiteshvara, and a willingness to engage deeply and to manifest and to be with others and to feel others' suffering and to let it touch him. And my point is that I think, you know, he's a good model of compassion, obviously, and that we should follow suit, you know, and not be shy to feel the suffering of others. And if we feel that lately, I'm just suggesting this is my own insight or my own point, but not to view that as something bad, but to let that in, you know, and to let that touch you, and to know you're following the path of Avalokiteshvara, so you're in good company then, is, I think, important. And so Avalokiteshvara, you know, and I think, you know, Avalokiteshvara looks with eyes of compassion. So we can also try to look with eyes of compassion. His name itself has a deep meaning, I think, right? The compassionate-eyed one, or the one who sees with compassion. And there's another gloss I want to give on his name also, and then I'll get to the Ishvara, Avalokiteshvara, but the Avalokite. they also say at one point, you know, so you could say he looks with eyes of compassion. He sees all the suffering of the world through eyes of compassion. And then they also say, one of the commentaries, I think it was by Vajrapani, it's an Indian, not the celestial Bodhisattva, but an Indian teacher, Indian master, Vajrapani. In one of his commentaries, he said, what kind of compassion does Avalokiteshvara have? And this gets at the meaning of the Heart Sutra, so that's why he included in his commentaries of the Heart Sutra, is he said, Avalokiteshvara sees beings with, they sometimes call it non-objectifying compassion, or, you know, so what it means is a compassion that understands that beings suffer, and at the same time beings are dependently arisen, and beings don't exist independently, don't exist inherently, right? In other words, so he has compassion for beings who are empty of inherent nature. And I think that's also important. The Dalai Lama, the commentary said that in reference to the Heart Sutra, but His Holiness Dalai Lama made a point once where he said, somebody had asked him, I think, how do you bear the, you know, he was like Dalai Lama, you know, for decades, right? He would meet with people who, like when people would come out of Tibet, the refugees, right? They've been tortured and had everything taken from them. And he would hug them, right? And they would cry and tell them their story of torture and of torment and of loss. And somebody said to the Dalai Lama, like, how do you tolerate, how do you bear it? How do you bear to hear and embrace so much suffering? And His Holiness, I don't remember the exact words, but in essence, he said, you know, he would cry with them and hold them. And then he also said, it's wisdom. It's wisdom that makes it bearable. You know, and that's what we're studying, right? That it's the wisdom understanding that all that suffering comes about through grasping at a self in an incorrect way. And that grasping at a self is just ignorance. And it has no foundation in reality. And one point is, you know, the nature of the mind is not like that. And beings have Buddha nature, and they can become Buddhas. You know, and therefore there's always hope, you know, that beings can change. And starting off with ourselves, that we can change, right? That we can become better. If we're willing to face our faults and work on them with wisdom, we can improve. And if we do that, then we can help somebody else improve, and then somebody else. You know, in the talk the other day, His Holiness Dalai Lama it was the Avalokiteshvara initiation. And then he said at the end of it, I thought it was very touching, he said, now teach others. And he said, and if each of you teach 10 people, and then they teach 10 more people, and then they teach 10 more, then the world will be a better place, right? That's what he was saying. And that reflects wisdom, right? And there is that people can change, that our minds can change. And they can change because they're empty of inherently being what they are now. And so, anyway, so there's always hope, is what the message of the Prajnaparamita's message actually is, that there's hope, isn't it? That's one of the messages. That you can change, that you can become a Buddha, that you can become the same as Avalokiteshvara, is part of the meaning here. And so then the latter part of Avalokiteshvara's name is, so Avalokite means the compassionate one, as they said. And then Ishvara is, in Tibetan, Wangchuk. They translate that as like accomplished or powerful master of the world. There's a Hindu god named Ishvara. There's one of the epithets of God in Hinduism, but the actual word in Sanskrit means like powerful Lord or something like that. And again, I often just, you know, these you could just say it's just a name or something, but I think these are worth thinking about. Like, so I just want to suggest that like, I think in the Buddhist context, that is what's powerful, right? Like actually, you know, I think part of what can make us, oh, you're right, Paul, about the number of eyes, but part of what can make us feel discouraged in a way is that I think sometimes we have the wrong idea. This word Ishvara, right, that Avalokiteshvara is Avalokiteshvara. You know, from a Tibetan Buddhist point of view, Avalokiteshvara is powerful, right? And I think sometimes we have the wrong idea of power. You know, so I'm just going to, this is my own gloss or reflection for a moment. But from a Buddhist perspective, right, Aryas are grounded in reality, and other beings are childish. You know what I mean? And so, you know, on a worldly level, right, there are childish people going around doing stupid things. But that's what childish people do, you know, and you know, part of what Avalokiteshvara does, you know, in working with the suffering of the world, if you look, is he takes a long-term perspective. Right? In other words, Avalokiteshvara has practiced, if you think of who is Avalokiteshvara, right? He's the 10th Bhumi Bodhisattva, he's somebody who's practiced the path to enlightenment for 3 countless great eons. Right? So that's somebody who has a long-term perspective for sure, right? And you know, when I say like countless great eon, it's supposed to be a 10 with like 57 or 58 zeros after it. That's how long he's been practicing. And so part of the point is that we have to take a long perspective there. And if you take a long perspective, then, you know, I often think, I'm going to go off on one more tangent and then I'll go back to the text. For myself, I often think of the story, there are a number of books that tell it, but of, you know, the Dalai Lamas and Avalokiteshvara, like this, that there were 2 different Dalai Lamas. Like one Dalai Lama went to Mongolia, like, you know, the Mongols, right, were the most powerful force in the world at the time, right? Under Genghis Khan, right? They were the most powerful military force. Actually, they read this. They were the most, as a, what's it called? Like a empire, I guess you'd use the word empire, right? As an empire, they conquered more of the world than any other empire in the history of the planet, right? All the way, I mean, at a certain point, they went all the way to Russia, all the way to the Middle East, and all the way to China, right, and Korea. So the largest empire covered the most territory and the most people of the world. And when Avalokiteshvara wanted to, what's the word? They were very warriors, you know. And when the Dalai Lamas, Dalai Lamas in the form of Chenrezig wanted to benefit them, you know, they took the form, right, of Bodhisattvas and went and taught. And over the course of lifetime, you know, there was a Dalai Lama who went and taught the Mongols, and then there was the Dalai Lama after him, the 3rd, I think, taught, and then the 4th, I think, was Mongolian. He took rebirth as the son of a Khan. And then the Mongolians loved the Dalai Lama suddenly, right? Because like so much, because he had taken rebirth as their son, the son of their Khan. You know, so by the time, I guess my point is like, you know, gradually they became Dharma practitioners. And then, of course, they lost, then once they became Dharma practitioners, then over the course of a number of generations, they lost control of China, they lost control of, because they stopped conquering, and became a very, you know, a much more, what's the word? There are people, too many of young men stopped becoming warriors and started becoming monks, you know, so they stopped conquering the world. But that's a long-term perspective. Does that make sense? He was like, well, you know, they're conquering the world, and over the course of 4 or 5 lifetimes, you know, help them. So anyway, they take a lot. Avalokiteshvara is powerful in that way, right? You know, he conquered, what's the word? Like all bodhisattvas, he conquers hate through love. And so that's Avalokiteshvara, right? The Bodhisattva Mahasara Arya Avalokiteshvara. Then it says, looked into, so what was he doing? So there's the Buddha there meditating on emptiness, right? Then there's Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. And he's looking into this very practice, the very practice. And then this word profound, right? Profound always means emptiness, right? So he's looking into the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom. And beheld those 5 aggregates also as an empty of inherent nature. And so when it says also, this is implying what we're going to get to in the rest of the sutra, is not, he was meditating on the emptiness of the 5 aggregates, but also, as we're going to go through, of the sources and the, you know, the sense powers and the sense objects and the 12 links of dependent origination. So it's saying the 5 aggregates also meaning in addition to other things. So these various kinds of phenomena that he's going to explain in the sutra, he was meditating on the emptiness of all of those different phenomena, which is the meaning of the profound perfection of wisdom, right? So, and because he was a 10th Bhumi Bodhisattva, right, he is somebody who had realized the meaning of the perfection of wisdom. And he was meditating on that in the presence of the Buddha. And I'll just, yeah, maybe this is a good time to make this point. Like, formally, I said last time I couldn't remember the total list, so I wanted to go through it very briefly. In a formal sense, like the way Buddhists categorize such things, there are said to be 3 kinds of sutras. One, which is the most common, are those spoken directly by the Buddha. A second are those spoken by Bodhisattvas or other disciples on behalf of the Buddha. And the third is those spoken by disciples or Bodhisattvas inspired by the Buddha. And most of the Heart Sutra is in the third category, right? Under the inspiration or the blessing power of the Buddhas, Avalokiteshvara and Shariputra are going to have a conversation. And it's said to be inspired by the Buddha. So it's that third kind mostly. There's a point at the end when the Buddha directly speaks, so that one would be, that part of the sutra would be spoken directly by the Buddha, obviously. But most of the sutra is considered to be inspired by the Buddha. So the Buddha is there in meditation, as we talked about last time. Paul asked about that. But and then there, you know, Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara are going to have this conversation. And so then I was going to just, I'll say one more thing because we're just a few more minutes, and I'm not sure how far I'll get into it, but we'll pick up with next time too. So it says here, the five aggregates also are empty, right? So the main topic of this sutra is going to be, you know, emptiness, of course. But Shariputra, you know, I'm sorry, Avalokiteshvara here, it meant that in reference to it mentions the 5 aggregates. Right? And the sutra is going to mention these things, right? Which are actually, you know, these topics, like what are the 5 aggregates, right, are mostly discussed in the Abhidharma literature, which is a different category of Buddhist literature, right? And the Abhidharma, I just want to go into that just as a little point here, because it's important. To understand the perfection of wisdom, it's useful. Is the Abhidharma literature is, first of all, it's, you know, Vasubandhu wrote some famous texts on Abhidharma, and Asanga did. And the Abhidharma, and also there are Theravadan Abhidharma texts. They're quite big, extensive, and wonderful. And the Abhidharma literature, what's I say it right? I mean, it covers many things, but really it describes aspects of reality in great detail. It's one major trait. So it describes like different ways of looking at like the world and at perception and at like so it covers things like what are the 5 aggregates? What are positive mental states in psychology, Buddhist psychology? What are afflicted mental states? What are neutral mental states? What are states that always accompany consciousness? And then, you know, it talks about the external world also, and how does it function? Kind of science text in a way from that time period. And it covers cosmology and psychology and things of that sort. And so so some of the and Lama Tsongkhapa actually in his commentary on the Prajnaparamita says, you know, the sutra, Perfection of Wisdom sutras like the Heart Sutra, he raises a question. He says, how are these different from the Abhidharma? And part of the point that's important is that the Abhidharma texts are teaching those categories of phenomena so that you can understand the world better. And the Heart Sutra also discusses those categories of phenomena, but the Heart Sutra's main emphasis is dependent origination and emptiness, right? The emptiness of those phenomena. That's not taught. Like, so in the Abhidharma, mostly just those phenomena are taught. But their being empty of intrinsic existence is not the explicit subject, is not the focus. Whereas in the Heart Sutra, it mentions those topics, but the main focus is on their dependent origination or their emptiness. So that's a difference. And I'll share my own. You know, I was sort of thinking, okay, well, you know, a lot of times when, like, if you look at Tendar Larampa's commentary, what striking me is a lot of the Tibetan commentaries were written for, and the Indian commentaries also, right, were written for monks, actually, mostly, to be honest. Like, if you think of Nalanda Monastery, it was monastic university, mostly monks. Or if Tendar Larampa was at Drepung, it was, you know, the largest, I think it was the largest monastic university, monastery ever existed in the world was Drepung. And so those monks already knew Abhidharma. Does that make sense? Like, so it was when they were studying a text like the Heart Sutra, and it said the 5 aggregates or this, the sources or the 12 links to dependent relation and so on, you know, those monks knew those categories by heart. And so when they were saying they're empty, they would know what, you know, they would sort of know what the referent was. But then it occurred to me in teaching it in this context that maybe people, I'm not sure how much people have studied, like what are those things? Like, do people know well the 5 skandhas and the 6 sources and the, you know, all those different topics? And so what I was thinking is maybe I'm not going to, I don't want to, this is not going to become a class on Abhidharma. That's a whole separate subject. But maybe as Avalokiteshvara sort of mentions these different categories of phenomena, I'll briefly cover what are they. So, and then you can understand how they're empty. Does that make sense? Because to sort of say, you know, like actually, it also, because one point is that emptiness doesn't, what part of the point here of the Heart Sutra is that emptiness is not something separate from phenomena. Does that make sense? Emptiness is the ultimate nature of phenomena, right? Later he's going to say form is emptiness, right? It means an emptiness is form, right? So it means that what's the ultimate nature of form? It's emptiness, right? And you know, and because of emptiness, because form is empty, it can appear to us. And so part of the point, I guess, is like, I guess, you know, at least in some basically, you have to know what the phenomena are, and then you can meditate on their emptiness. Does that make sense? And so, you know, some of you may know those topics and some may not, and, you know, I don't know, but I'm not going to, I guess what I'm going to try to do as we go forward now, and now we're going to get into like really the heart of this, the heart of the Heart Sutra. But as we do that, what I'm thinking I'll do is just like with each of these different categories that Avalokiteshvara is going to now explain as empty, I'll just give a brief overview or brief summary of what are they from the Abhidharma's perspective. And then we'll mostly focus on what Avalokiteshvara is actually saying, which is in what sense are they empty, right? And the emptiness part is not taught in the Abhidharma. Abhidharma doesn't focus on how are those things empty of inherent nature. I'm not sure whether I cover one more point. Maybe I'll pause there and say, ask, are there any, first of all, if there are questions, then we can do that. Or if not, then I'll make one more point. But any questions? Cynthia, go ahead. You unmute me.
So now, is there some reference book on like Abhidharma?
There are lots of books on Abhidharma. The one I'll probably use the most because I like it, and also it's said to be Tibetans say actually. So it's called the one text I really like on Abhidharma. It's thick. It's called "The Ornament of Abhidharma: A Commentary to Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha" by Chim Jampayong. And sort of laughing. You know, one reason I mean, I like this commentary on the Abhidharma, and also you know, Gelugpa Lama's let's see if I say this right, most often praise commentaries by Tsongkhapa or his 2 closest disciples, and Chimpa Jampayong lived before Tsongkhapa. So the fact that Gelugpa Lama say it's the best commentary ever written on the Abhidharma, I'm like, wow, that must really be quite good if even, you know, that's what I say, right? It's not written by, Chim Jampayong was not Gelugpa because he lived before Tsongkhapa's time. So if even Gelugpa Lamas will say it's the best one ever written, then it must be quite good, I figure. So that's the one I'll probably use the most when I refer to that. For the 5 aggregates, I was also looking at Art. You know, some of you know Art Engel, a wonderful translator. He's a friend. And he has a book called The Inner Science of Buddhist Practice, Vasubandhu's Summary of the 5 Heaps. That's particularly on the 5 skandhas. And you'll notice, right, both are related to Vasubandhu, who is Asanga's half-brother, you know, because he wrote Vasubandhu wrote a lot on the Abhidharma topics. He was a great master of the Abhidharma. And again, you know, my goal is not to go into great detail, but I'll mostly rely on this one by Chim Jampayong. And again, you know, the focus just being there to briefly sort of say what are these things, and then focus on how in what sense are they empty.
Lauren, I have another question. This is Sarah again.
Sure.
I don't know if you're going to talk about this one of the other weeks when we start to get into this stuff, but I wonder what is the significance of Avalokiteshvara talking about the 5 aggregates sort of first. He talks about the 5 aggregates and then he says, similarly, all these other things. So I wonder if there's a significance to mentioning the aggregates first.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, there are various significances, and there actually, it's interesting. There are various ways of. I'll say a couple. I mean, there actually. I'm sort of probably just today or yesterday, as I was sort of preparing for class, I was thought, well, we're not going to cover this yet, but there are like, Avalokiteshvara presents the, the sutra in this order, that he does, and I was thinking about this, and I was trying to think, how to cover this in the class. I was trying to decide how to do it in the future, not today, of course, but in future classes, because it's almost like there are different, and it kind of answers your question that there are at least 2 or 3 different ways of looking at the order in which Avalokiteshvara presents things, and each of them, it's meaningful. In other words, it's almost like there are different. I mean, it's a very beautiful, subtle sutra in a way, where you can look at the order in which Avalokiteshvara presents things, and it's like there are a number of sort of ways of looking at the sequencing that make that sequencing quite meaningful. And I think they're all correct. And I don't think he did it in this order for just one reason. I think there are numerous reasons why he presented them in this order. And so I think hopefully, so I guess one point is, so I mean, I won't fully answer that question right now, because you'll see over time that they're I really think that's interesting. That maybe what I should do, that might be a good way to do it next time, as I think about it, is almost give that structural overview or something. And then I want to get into the 5 aggregates. That'll be the next class, is really to get into what are the 5 aggregates and what does it mean that they're empty. So I think one point is that I think there are various ways to look at the sequencing that are significant. But then another point I'll make is, if you look at the Lamrim and at for example, Tsongkhapa's various great treatise and the middle length treatise on the Lamrim, he points out that it's an interesting point. When lamas teach about emptiness, they often start with objects, right? The Tibetans, will often be a vase, right? They'll say, if you hear Tibetan talk, usually they'll say, the vase, or the certain, there's certain traditional things they use, but any object, physical object. Chandrakirti uses a chariot at one point in his text, the Majjhimaka Avatara. But Tsongkhapa points out, when actually meditating on emptiness, you begin with yourself, your own sense of I. And the main thing that the main basis that we grasp at as being the I is the 5 aggregates. So I guess one point I'll make is, there are various ways. So again, hopefully over time, you'll see that there are a number of ways in which it's meaningful that he covers the 5 aggregates first. But at least as a starting point, I'll say, I think one, from a practice perspective, when we actually are going to realize emptiness, we have to start with our sense of, our individual sense of self-grasping. At my sense, you are my sense of I, of self. And the main basis upon which we grasp most frequently in daily life at the sense of I is the 5 aggregates. And so, so I think that's one reason, is from a practice perspective, it makes sense in that way. And I'll mention one other, actually, is, one thing I was thinking about just, again, is another way of systematizing his presentation is also, there's another way of looking at Buddhist practice, which in a way is the same thing I just said, but from a different angle, is we sometimes talk about basis, path, and result, right? The basis is like the ordinary state. The path is the practices a bodhisattva goes through, and then the result is, in this case, Buddhahood, right? It's Mahayana Sutra. And another way of looking at the sequencing here, which sort of, we'll cover this a little more next time, but is Avalokiteshvara covers, that the basis is empty, and the basis is, starts with the 5 aggregates. And then eventually he'll get to the path, which is also empty, and then even the resultant state is empty. And they always go in that order because that's, you know, from a practitioner's perspective, right now, all we have is the basis, right? And so we have to first reflect on what we experience. Then as we progress, we'll eventually have experiences of the path. But then the path itself is empty of inherent existence. And if it weren't, you couldn't traverse it. Does that make sense? And then the resultant state is also empty of inherent existence. And if it weren't, you couldn't achieve it. Because it would have had to already be intrinsically existent independently, but it's not. It comes about due to causes and conditions and due to dependent origination, which means it's empty. And so that's another way of thinking. So one way I think is from a practice perspective that the 5 aggregates are what we grasp at most, and so it's a good starting point. The other is it's the basis, you know, and then we'll, as I say, because you'll see in the sequencing, you can go basis, path, and result. So I think those are 2 reasons. There are probably others too.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lauren?
Yeah.
I wanted to clarify, Avalokiteshvara and the Buddha Avalokiteshvara in this context are the same being, correct?
Yeah, I think so. Like, it was interesting. Like His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, in his commentary said, you know, in this context, think of him as a 10th Bhumi Bodhisattva, which is interesting. But I think, you know, in Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche, when he taught the Heart Sutra at Guya Samadhi, I was looking back in my notes, and he said, you know, he kind of said, well, actually, Avalokiteshvara was a Buddha. You know, so I think a useful way to think of it is that, you know, actually it says that, like later in, even in, where is it? In Tendar Larampa's commentary, he makes the point that even like, you know, that Buddhas can manifest in the form of Bodhisattvas or even in the form of Arhats. And so I think, you know, if you're a tantric practitioner, then best to think it is, you know, it's the same being. It's Buddha Avalokiteshvara manifesting as a 10th Bhumi Bodhisattva. You know, and there are many stories that, right, like they say Manjushri, for example, right, when he vowed when he was a Bodhisattva, when I become a Buddha, I'll manifest as a Bodhisattva wherever there are Buddhas and ask questions about emptiness so that people will understand emptiness better and so on. So I think that's the most useful way to view it. But for somebody who, let's say, anyway, yeah, I think that's the most.
So is that saying there is a Buddha Manjushri?
Yeah.
There is a Buddha. Okay.
Yeah, from a tantric perspective, for sure, yeah. Yeah, Buddha Tara, Buddha Manjushri, Buddha.
Well,
sure.
From the view, yeah, but I'm not being clear. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, any other questions? We stop in a minute, but one last question. Are we good?
Yes, I have questions.
Oh, sure.
Yes, so we have to practice the 6 perfections in order to get the perfection of wisdom, emptiness. Without the 6, practicing the 6 perfection first, then it won't be a complete perfection, complete realization of wisdom, is right? Even just doing meditation and learning.
That's right. Yeah. Especially because if you think about, like we said earlier, like the final ultimate meaning of the perfection of wisdom is the mind of a Buddha, right? The realization of a Buddha. And that's really important point you're making, is that there is wisdom alone will not produce the final result of a Buddha's mind. You have to practice all 6 perfections. And I'll even mention, like in the they sometimes, like, in other words, I guess you could say, like, the perfection of wisdom in a way is you say that is, you know, well, it's the last of the perfections, is the most difficult, but it's also in some ways, you know, all the other perfections have to be influenced by wisdom, but you can't become, yeah, that's right, you can't achieve the mind of a Buddha, the final expression of the perfection of wisdom, without practicing perfections of generosity and you know, ethics and patience and joyous effort and concentration. That's right.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, so we definitely need all 6 perfections. Yeah, there's like I don't remember how it goes in the what's it called, the Uttara Tantra text teaching by Maitreya. He makes this analogy where he points out, like, you know, if you think of, like, he gives this analogy of like painting a Buddha, like a mural of the Buddha, and you know that what's the say right? That you need all the components. You know, you need many colors to paint a mural of the Buddha. You need the brushes, you need the artists, you need the people that, you know, and so in that way you need all six perfections. He uses that analogy, so you need all six perfections to create a Buddha, to bring about the result of a Buddha. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Wow. Look, I guess it's a little after 12:30, so we should do our dedication, and then I think, do we have class? I think we have class next week.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we'll continue. So next time we'll talk a little bit about, I think we'll do that. We'll cover a little bit on just like the structure of the sutra. We'll cover, you know, the next verse about Shariputra's question. And then we'll cover, I want to make sure next time we'll start really into the definition of the 5 aggregates and in what sense they're empty. So that'll be the topics for next time. But let's do our verse of dedication. 2 verses. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara. And thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you.